My daughter begged me to co-sign her loan. 9 weeks later, her phone stopped taking my calls. And the first person who told me the truth about where that money went was not my daughter. It was a stranger in a bank's fraud office who had never once shaken my hand. I want you to hold on to that because it took me almost 4 days to understand what it actually meant. A woman sitting in a cubicle on Market Street knew more about my own child's life than I did, and she was the one who said the sentence I still hear when the house gets quiet at night. Mr. Bramwell, please don't sign anything else until you've looked at this. My name is Hollis Bramwell. Most people just say Hall. I'm 65 years old, and I own a glass and mirror shop on Rossville Boulevard in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I started it in 1991 in a rented bay behind a tire store with one used edging machine and $4,000 borrowed from a retired shop teacher named Buford Reese, who let me pay him back $20 a week for 5 years and never once asked me about it in front of another person. I spent most of my life believing something simple. I believed that if you worked honest and you loved your family without holding anything back, that love would find its way home to you in the same shape you sent it out. I was wrong. Not about the working part, about the rest of it. This is the story of the worst spring of my life, and the 1 minute inside it that I will carry to my grave. Standing in a bank office with the blinds half closed, watching a young man in a gray sweater turn a folder around so I could read it right side up. But none of it lands right unless you know where we started. I married my wife Junie in 1987, 39 years this coming fall. We live on Kestrel Lane in Red Bank, a little town tucked under the ridge just north of the city. 3 bedrooms, a carport I closed in and turned into a workshop, and a back fence that runs up against a stand of old hickories where the deer come through at dusk. Nothing about it is fancy. We paid it off in 2016, and I remember standing in the driveway that evening, holding the paperwork like a man holding a fish he was proud of. We raised 2 children in that house. My son Wendell, who has been Dell since he was 4, is 32. He teaches shop and applied technology at a middle school in East Ridge. He married a school bus driver named Shanice, and the 2 of them live in a rented duplex with a leaky carport and a dog with 3 legs. Dell has never once in his adult life asked me for money, not for the wedding. Not when Shanice's transmission went out in February and they took turns dropping each other off for a month. I want you to remember that, because it matters more than anything else in this story. My daughter Delia is 36, sharp, funny, the kind of person who walks into a room and the room turns toward her. She has been in climbing gyms since she was 20, started at the front desk, learned route setting, ran shifts, then ran a whole facility over in Knoxville for 3 years. And for a long time I told myself that was Delia finding her feet. Every parent tells themselves some version of that. Then in January, on a cold Thursday, Delia called and asked if she could come to dinner and bring somebody. She said she had something she wanted to lay out for me and her mother. Nothing heavy, she said. Nothing heavy is never nothing heavy. She showed up with a rolled-up set of blueprints and a woman named Sloane Dupree. Sloane was maybe 42, silver rings on both hands, a jacket that cost more than my first truck, and a way of listening that made you feel like the smartest man at your own table. She'd been consulting for fitness businesses for years, she said. Franchise build-outs, equipment sourcing. She and Delia had met at a setting clinic in Asheville and had been talking about this idea for 2 years. Thunderhead Climbing, an old warehouse on Cowart Street down in the South Broad district. 40-foot walls, a bouldering cave, a coffee bar in the front corner where the loading door used to be. Delia had the whole thing drawn out to scale, right down to where the chalk dust filtration would run. I'll be honest with you, I was moved. My daughter was sitting at my kitchen table talking about something with fire in her voice, instead of just getting through another year. Junie put her hand on my knee under the table. She saw it too. The number was $330,000. An SBA loan through Lookout Savings Bank, the branch on Market Street. They had about $80,000 of their own between savings and a small investor Sloane knew from Nashville. But the bank wanted a personal guarantor with real credit and real property before they'd fund the rest. Delia's credit was thin. Sloane's, I found out much later, was worse than thin, though nobody mentioned that over pot roast. "Daddy," Delia said, and I remember exactly how she said it. Slow, careful, like she'd practiced it in the car with the engine off. "I'm not asking you for $1. I'm asking you to put your name next to mine on a piece of paper, so a bank will believe what I already believe." Junie was quiet while we brushed our teeth that night, and I know that quiet. 39 years teaches you to read a woman's silence the way you read a sky before a storm. "Hall," she said finally, sitting on the edge of the bed rubbing lotion into her hands. "I want to be excited. I do. But that Sloane woman answered 2 questions Delia was asked. Did you notice that?" Delia opened her mouth and Sloane talked instead. Both times. I told her she was overthinking it. I told her Delia had spent 16 years learning this business from the floor up and had finally been handed a real shot at it. And what kind of father am I if my own nerves are the reason my daughter never gets to try? I told myself that love without risk isn't really love. I signed the personal guarantee on the 12th of February in a small conference room on the 3rd floor of that Market Street branch, across the table from a senior commercial lender named Bernadette Osei. Steady woman. Cardigan, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, a handshake that meant something. She walked me through every single page and did not rush one of them. She made sure I understood that if the business defaulted, the bank could pursue my personal assets, my house, my shop, the land under it, all of it. I nodded, like a man who understood exactly what he was agreeing to. I did not understand exactly what I was agreeing to. I want to be honest about that because people always ask. What I didn't know, sitting there watching Delia grin at me from the other end of the table, was that the next time I walked into that building, it would not be to sign a thing. It would be to hear a sentence that closed one chapter of my life and cracked open another. The first 10 weeks were good, genuinely, honestly good. Delia sent me photographs almost every day, the floor being ground down, the old freight door being framed out for glass, which she wanted me to fabricate at cost, so my name would be in the building somewhere. She called most Sunday evenings and walked me through the budget line by line, asking my opinion on equipment, because she knew I'd spent 35 years around fabrication and around money. For 10 weeks, I felt like the father I always meant to be. Useful, trusted, needed the right way instead of the wrong way. Then in early May it started to thin out. I noticed the way you notice a refrigerator that stopped humming. Not all at once, just a hole where a sound used to be. One Sunday came and went, then another. I texted. I got short answers back. "Crazy week. Call you soon." The kind of message you send to manage a person, not to talk to one. On the 3rd of June, a piece of mail showed up at my house that I wasn't expecting. Lookout Savings Bank, addressed to me as guarantor. It said the business operating account tied to the loan had failed a scheduled draw reconciliation and that a compliance review had been opened. I didn't understand half the words. I understood the temperature of it. I called Delia that night. Voicemail. I called the next morning before the shop opened. Voicemail. Over the next week I called her 11 times, and every one of them dropped into the same flat recording telling me to leave a message. Then on the 11th of June, a Wednesday, I called one more time. And instead of ringing through the way it always had, there was a single short tone, and then nothing at all. If you've ever heard that sound, you know it. It's a specific kind of silence. It's the sound of a number that has been blocked. I stood in my kitchen holding my phone out in front of me, like it might change its mind. 36 years, my daughter had slammed doors, she'd said things she regretted, she'd gone months without visiting. She had never once shut me out of her phone. I called Junie in from the porch and showed her the screen, and watched her face travel from confused to scared in about 4 seconds. That's when I called Ozzie Pruitt. Ozzie ran a powder coating shop 3 units down from mine on Rossville for 19 years. We've been eating breakfast together since 1994. He is the only man alive who will tell me the truth while I'm still in the mood to argue with it. We met at Farrell's Pancake House on Brainerd Road, same booth by the window we always take. I laid the whole thing out. He let me finish. "Hall," he said, turning his coffee cup a quarter turn at a time the way he does when he's about to say something I won't enjoy. When a grown woman blocks her daddy's number 4 months after that daddy signs his house onto her loan, that's not a mood, that's a decision. I don't want to believe that, Ozzy. I know you don't. He set the cup down. But you haven't been down to that building, have you? I hadn't. So the next morning I got in my truck before the crew showed up, and I drove down to Cowart Street myself. I want you to picture what I expected. Scaffolding, a crew, maybe a banner. Delia had told me in April they were 8 weeks from a soft open, and 8 weeks from April is not far from where we were. What I found was a warehouse with a chain and a padlock through the door handles that had not been there in the photographs. The front windows were still papered over from the inside. A dumpster sat at the curb with rain standing in the bottom of it, and weeds already coming up around the wheels. I walked around to the side where a gap in the paper let a little light through, and I put my hands around my eyes and looked in. The floor was ground and sealed. That part was real. But the walls, the actual climbing walls, the whole reason the building existed, were not there. There was steel framing standing up in 2 corners and nothing on it. No panels, no holds. Over by the far wall sat a stack of pallets, still in factory shrink wrap, and I could see rope in some of them, still coiled, still tagged. And in the ceiling, where the anchors go, the anchors that everything else in a climbing gym hangs from, there was nothing, bare joists. Not one bolt set. I've been around construction and fabrication my whole working life. I stood at that window doing arithmetic in my head, and the arithmetic would not come out right no matter how I ran it. I didn't know it yet, standing on that empty sidewalk with my hands still cupped against the glass. But the answer I was looking for was never going to come from my daughter. It was going to come from a phone call I almost didn't answer. Welcome back to the channel. If you're just joining me, go ahead and get your coffee and settle in, because this next part is where the whole thing turned sideways on me. If you've been riding with me a while, you already know what I'm going to ask. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what a bank employee showed me 4 days after I stood at that window is the reason my family still exists in one piece. The call came on the 16th of June, a Monday, right around 10 in the morning. I was in the back of my shop cutting down a sheet of low iron for a shower enclosure when my phone lit up with a Chattanooga number I didn't know. I almost let it ring out. I'm glad I didn't. "Mr. Bramwell," the voice said. "This is Bernadette Osei at Lookout Savings. We met in February when you signed as personal guarantor on the Thunderhead climbing loan. I remember you," I said, and everything around me went strangely far away. "Mr. Bramwell," she said, and there was something very careful in her voice. The tone of somebody who has made this call before and knows exactly how much it weighs. "I'd like you to come into the branch today if you're able. There's documentation connected to this loan that you need to see with your own eyes before you take any action of your own." I asked her straight out, standing there with my hand still on the glass cutter, whether my daughter was in trouble. She was quiet a beat too long. "Mr. Bramwell, I'd rather walk you through it in person. I don't want to hand you half a picture over the phone. I was in my truck in 9 minutes. They put me in the same third-floor room where I'd signed my name in February. Same table, same chair, I think. Except this time Bernadette wasn't by herself. There was a young man beside her in a gray sweater, maybe 30, with a folder in front of him thick enough that my stomach dropped before anybody said a word. She introduced him as Curtis Yoon, from the bank's Fraud and Financial Crimes Unit. "Mr. Bramwell," Bernadette said, sliding the folder across. "I'm going to go slow. Stop me any time. There is no wrong question in this room. Here is what that folder told me. Draw schedules, wire confirmations, and vendor invoices that I read 3 separate times each, because I truly did not want any of it to be true. The $330,000 had been structured to release in construction draws tied to milestones. That's standard. Floor prep, steel, wall systems, equipment, opening inventory. Every draw required documentation, invoices from licensed vendors, and signatures from both owners before the bank moved a dollar. Over 11 weeks, across 9 draws, $232,000 had been released. The building I had stood outside of 4 days earlier had, by the bank's own inspector's estimate, about $48,000 of completed work in it. The invoices had come from 3 vendors. One was a concrete and flooring outfit out of East Ridge that had done real work, done it well, and been paid a fair price. The other 2 did not survive 10 minutes of looking at. Summit Equipment Leasing had a website with stock photos on it and a business registration 2 months older than the loan. And Dupree Athletic Concepts, listed on the paperwork as a specialty build-out consultant, was registered to a residential address in Ringgold, Georgia, 20 minutes over the state line. Its managing member was Sloan Dupree. I sat there and could not make my mind close around it. My daughter's business partner had set up a company in her own name, submitted it to the bank as an independent vendor, and had the bank wire loan money directly into an account she controlled, over and over, 9 separate times. Curtis turned a page and showed me a delivery receipt for $18,000 of auto belay equipment. Signed for, received, delivered to that same residential address in Ringgold, not to Cowart Street. "Where is my daughter in all this?" I asked. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Curtis didn't flinch and he didn't soften it into mush, and I have thought about that a lot since. He said, "Mr. Bramwell, your daughter's signature is on 7 of the 9 draw requests. As co-owner, hers was required for release. I am not in a position to tell you what she understood when she signed them. Bank records can't answer that question. What I can tell you," he said, "is that the pattern here, funds landing in the operating account and leaving for a related party account inside 24 to 72 hours, is what our team classifies as structured diversion. We flagged it internally 18 days ago and froze the undispersed balance the same afternoon. That is the only reason there is still $98,000 sitting in that account instead of gone. I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that chair, because I think it's the truest thing in this whole story. I did not feel rage first. I felt grief, the physical kind. The kind that sits low and heavy under your ribs, like something you swallowed that won't go down or come up. Because I wasn't only looking at fraud in that folder, I was looking at 7 pages with my daughter's handwriting on them, the same loopy capital D she's used since the 4th grade. And I did not know yet whether that handwriting belonged to a victim or a partner. "Mr. Bramwell," Bernadette said, easing the folder half shut, "I asked you here because as guarantor, you'll receive formal notice of default proceedings within the next 2 weeks, if this isn't resolved. I've watched guarantors get that letter cold and do something in a panic that cost them twice what they were afraid of, selling a house under value, draining a retirement account. I didn't want that to be you." I asked her why she'd go to the trouble. She looked at me a second, and something in her face let go a little. "Because in February you asked me 3 different times what would happen to your wife if this ever went wrong," she said. "Most people ask what happens to them. You didn't." I remembered. I drove home and didn't say a word for almost 20 minutes. Just sat at the kitchen table with my hands folded while Junie stood at the sink not washing anything, waiting. Because 39 years teaches a woman when a silence needs room before it can turn into sentences. "Hall," she said finally, "say it out loud or you're going to carry it wrong." So I told her. Every page, every number, every name. I watched her go the same road I'd gone. Disbelief, then grief. Then something harder underneath it that took hold and stayed. "That woman," she said. "I told you she answered Delia's questions for her." "You did," I said. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend you didn't. But here's what I still didn't know at that table. I didn't know where my daughter was. And I didn't know whether she'd been hiding from me because she helped rob her own father, or because she was drowning in something she never started and couldn't figure out how to say out loud. I was about to learn that the answer was more complicated and a whole lot sadder than either story I'd built. I called Ozzy and asked him to come by the shop early the next morning, before my crew, where we could talk without an audience. He sat on an upturned bucket by my bench and let me get all the way to the end without one interruption, which for Ozzy is close to a religious experience. "Hollow," he said, "before you have a conversation with your daughter, you need a lawyer. Not because you're going to sue anybody, Because if you go to her hot, whatever she tells you, you won't be able to trust it. And neither will anybody else down the road if this lands in a courtroom. He was right, and I hated it. So that afternoon, I called an attorney a customer of mine had used on a contract fight a few years back. A woman named Harriet Blount, small office over on Fraser Avenue, no wasted words anywhere in the building. I sat down and told her everything Curtis Yoon had shown me. She took notes in tiny, even handwriting. Then she put her pen down. "Mr. Bramwell," she said, "two things. One, as guarantor, you have the right to request the complete loan file from the bank yourself, independent of anything your daughter tells you. Ask for it today. Two, find her." Not to confront her, to look at her. She leaned forward. There is a real difference, under the law and under any decent understanding of a family, between a partner who helped move that money and a partner who got used by somebody she trusted and is now too ashamed to pick up the phone. Right now you have no idea which one you're dealing with, and neither do I. Don't decide before you know. I want to be honest. I had not given that second possibility any real weight until she said it in a room with the door closed. Driving home from that bank the day before, I'd been certain. I'd been so sure my daughter had looked at her own father's signature and decided it was worth spending. I'd built that in 96 hours flat, and I'd built it out of hurt, not out of one single fact. Harriet requested the full file that afternoon. It landed in my email a little after 9 that night, hundreds of pages, and I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and worked through it until almost 2 in the morning, checking dates against dates, the way I'd check a tolerance sheet, because that is what my hands and my brain do when the rest of me is coming apart. And somewhere past 1 o'clock, in a section of the file I almost skipped because it looked like nothing, I found it. It was a call log, an internal record of contacts to the bank's general customer service line. On a Sunday in the middle of May, at 8:52 in the evening, a caller had reached the after-hours line from a Chattanooga landline and left a voicemail. The log entry was 4 lines long. It listed the caller as D. Bramwell, co-borrower, Thunderhead Climbing. It listed the subject as, and I read this maybe 15 times, Question Ray, vendor invoices not matching site work, requests callback. And then, underneath, the disposition code, routed to branch servicing queue. Not escalated, no callback recorded. My daughter had called the bank. She had sat down on a Sunday night in the middle of May, before I ever got a letter, before I ever called her, and she had picked up a phone and told a bank employee's voicemail that the invoices didn't match the building. And that message went into a queue for routine servicing questions, sat there behind account balance requests and address changes, and nobody ever called her back. I sat in my kitchen at 2 in the morning with that on the screen, and something that had been clamped shut in my chest for 5 days came loose, just enough to let me breathe. She saw it. She asked the question I would have asked. And then somewhere between that Sunday and the day she blocked my number, something went badly wrong. I still didn't know what, but I was 2 days away from finding out, in a place I would never in 100 years have thought to look. Ozzy found her, and it wasn't detective work. It was a niece. Kaylin Pruitt works dispatch for a security company that covers half the office towers downtown. Ozzy asked her offhand to keep an ear out. 3 days later, she called him back and said there was a woman on the overnight janitorial crew at the Whitfield Tower on Broad Street who matched what he described. Signed in every night as D. Marchetti. Marchetti was my mother's maiden name. I drove down there on the 20th of June and parked in the loading dock lot a little after midnight, and I sat in my truck for 25 minutes with the engine off, because I honestly did not know which version of my daughter I was about to see. I went in through the service entrance, and Kaylin's second shift man walked me to the lobby, and there she was. She was running a floor buffer across black marble in an empty lobby under half the lights, with her hair pushed up under a company cap and a shirt 2 sizes too big for her. She was thinner than I have ever seen her, not gym thin, the other kind. She looked up and saw me standing by the elevators, and she shut the machine off, and in the quiet that dropped over that lobby, I watched every bit of color leave my daughter's face. We stood out on the loading dock for over an hour. She cried before I did, which surprised me, because Delia hadn't cried in front of me since she was 15 years old and totaled her mother's car on Signal Mountain Road. "Daddy," she said, and the words kept catching. "I found the invoice problem in May." I pulled the Dupree Athletic Concepts numbers against the actual site log, and there was $100 and something thousand of consulting on paper for a building with no walls in it. I asked her. She had an answer for everything: supplier deposits, retainers, timing. So I called the bank. "I know," I said. "I know you did. I found the log last night." She looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "Nobody ever called me back," she said. "Nobody ever called me back," and I thought, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm the idiot here who doesn't understand how commercial build-outs work. And then 2 weeks later, Sloan came into the office with the phone bill for the gym landline printed out, and one line on it circled in red pen. She sat down across from me, and she was so calm, Daddy. That's the part I can't get out of my head. She was so calm. She said, "Delia, your signature is on 7 draw requests. Mine is on 9. If this goes anywhere, it goes to both of us. And I'll say you signed every one of them knowing exactly where the money was going. And your own handwriting will back me up. And your father's house is the collateral, not mine." She said, "You don't have a case. You have a father with a paid-off house." Delia wiped her face with the back of her wrist. So I panicked. I thought if I could just put money back before anybody noticed, I could quiet it down, and you'd never have to know how badly I'd been played. I sold my truck. I gave up my apartment. I took every hour of night work I could get that pays weekly, and I blocked your number because I couldn't stand hearing your voice and lying to you," she said. "And I couldn't stand telling you the truth either. I didn't know how to do either one, so I did the coward thing and made the choice impossible. I stood on that loading dock at 1 in the morning, looking at my daughter in a borrowed work shirt, buffing marble under a false name, to quietly repair a disaster she didn't start. And I want to be careful here. She was not innocent. I want to say that plainly, because people always ask me. She was slow. She trusted the wrong person for too long, and then she got frightened and disappeared. And 7 of her own signatures sit in a federal loan file no matter what she meant by them. Fear is a reason. It is not an eraser. But she had not conspired against her own father. She'd been worked over by somebody who studied her, and then frozen solid by the exact story I had spent 5 days building in my head, and she'd been too proud and too broken to make the one call that would have actually saved her. I did not hug her out there. I want to be honest about that too. What I did was put my hand flat on her shoulder, the way I used to when she was small, and standing at the edge of the high dive, and I said, "Go tell them you're leaving. We're going to fix this the right way, starting tonight. But you're going to tell me every single piece of it on the drive, and you're not going to spare yourself in the telling." The next 2 weeks moved faster than anything in my life since the year I opened the shop. Harriet Blount walked Delia through a full documented statement for the bank's fraud unit, the call log, the phone bill, the threat. Every text message between her and Sloan going back 18 months, which Delia had never deleted, and which turned out to be the strongest thing in the whole file. Curtis Yoon's team pulled the corporate records on Dupree Athletic Concepts and cross-checked them against a name that had come up before. 2 years earlier, in Knoxville, under a different LLC with a different acronym, Sloan Dupree had done a version of this same thing to a woman who ran a small physical therapy studio. That woman had no lawyer, no guarantor with any property, and no way to fight it. She'd taken a settlement, signed a non-disclosure, and lost the business. It never made a courtroom. It never made a newspaper. On the 9th of July, the Hamilton County District Attorney's Office filed charges against Sloan Dupree for theft, over $60,000, and forgery in connection with the diverted draws, with federal wire fraud referred separately. Because the bank froze that $98,000 before it could move, and because Delia's cooperation handed prosecutors a clean paper trail with dates on it, restitution proceedings opened to recover as much of the missing money as possible out of Sloan's personal property, which it turned out included a 28-foot travel trailer she bought in April, with money that should have been ceiling anchors. The bank restructured the loan. Working with Harriet and Bernadette, and with the fraud findings sitting on the table, we negotiated my personal guarantee down to the funds that were actually used for the business. Once the flooring contractor's real invoices were verified, that came to a little over $61,000. That is not nothing. I felt every dollar of it. But it was not the $330,000 hole I'd been staring into alone at my kitchen table 2 weeks earlier either. Delia is paying her half. Not me, her. She rides a bus and a borrowed bicycle. She works days setting routes at a gym in Hickson and nights on that same overnight crew. And every other Friday she sits at my kitchen table and shows me the ledger, and I look at it and I ask questions, and I do not reach for my checkbook. I helped her understand the debt. I did not lift it off her. Some debts, even the ones that aren't all the way your fault, have to be paid with your own 2 hands. That's the only way the lesson sets. Buford Reese taught me that with $4,000 and $20 a week, and I'd have been robbing my own daughter to teach her anything else. But there's one more part of this, and it's the part that changed me the most. Somewhere in the middle of building the timeline for Harriet, I was scrolling back through months of messages, and I found something I had completely missed. 2 things, actually. The first was a text from my son Dell, sent the night after that January dinner. I'd read it at the time with the television on. "Dad, I don't want to be the wet blanket, but I watched Sloane the whole night, and she never once said the word we without saying the word I right after it. I deal with kids all day who are performing confidence to cover something. That's what that was. Please make somebody run her background before you sign anything." I had replied with a thumbs up. A thumbs up. That's it. That's what I gave him. The second thing I found was worse, and I found it by accident. In Delia's bank records. In a column, Harriet was checking for something else entirely. For 3 months, somebody had been sending my daughter $400 on the 1st of every month. Dell, a middle school shop teacher with a leaky carport and a wife driving a bus route at 5 in the morning, had been quietly paying part of his big sister's rent while she was hiding from the whole family. He never told me. He never told his mother. When I finally asked him about it, he looked at the floor and said she wouldn't say what was wrong, but she stopped posting pictures of the build in March, and she stopped answering Shanice, and I figured whatever it was, she still had to eat. I asked him why he never said anything to me. He said, "Because you'd have called her, and she'd have blocked me too." I called Dell on a Sunday in August and asked him to come to dinner, just him and Shanice and us. No reason given. I sat him down at that same kitchen table, and I told him the whole story front to back, and then I told him I owed him an apology from January. "You saw it before anybody," I said. "You put it in writing, and I sent you a picture of a thumb, because I wanted to believe in your sister's dream so badly that I couldn't stand to hear one word that got in the way of it. That wasn't fair to you. It's never been fair to you. Dell has never asked me for $1 in his life. Not one. But he has a thing he wants. He's mentioned it maybe 4 times in 6 years and never pushed it once. He wants to run a free after-school trade shop for foster kids and kids aging out of the system. Welding, small engines, basic electrical, cabinetry, real skills that pay a real wage. He says he watches boys come through his classroom at 13, who nobody has ever handed a tool to on purpose, and then he watches them come back at 19, and he already knows how it went. In September, Junie and I sat down with Harriet and restructured our own estate. Not out of guilt, and not to buy anybody's loyalty, because Dell's was never for sale in the first place. That's exactly the point. We put the old shop bay on Rossville, the original one I bought in 2003, and have been renting out ever since, into a dedicated trust, along with $90,000 out of savings, earmarked to open that program when he's ready for it. The rest of what we have gets split evenly between both our children when we're gone, structured this time with the kind of protections I wish to God I'd understood in February. When I told Dell what we'd done, sitting at that same kitchen table, he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he put his head down on his forearms like a kid at a desk and my 32-year-old son cried harder than he did at his own wedding. He said, through all of it, that he never once did any of it expecting something back. I know, I told him. That's the only reason you're getting it. It's been 7 months now since the night on that loading dock. Thunderhead Climbing never opened. Delia walked away from the lease, instead of trying to save something built on that foundation, and I have never been prouder of a decision she's made. She's back setting routes and running a floor for somebody else, saving slow, talking sometimes about trying again in 5 or 6 years. Smaller, simpler. With partners she's actually paid somebody to look into, and a father who is going to ask a great many more questions before he signs a single page. Sloan Dupree's case is still moving. Restitution has clawed back about 35% so far, and Curtis Yoon tells me the fraud unit has now connected her to the Knoxville matter and to one more complaint out of northern Alabama, which means whatever happens to her from here won't only be about my family anymore. That woman in Knoxville got a phone call from an investigator 2 years after she lost everything, and she cried on the phone. That's what I keep thinking about. I think a lot about walking into that Market Street branch not knowing whether I was about to learn my daughter had betrayed me or been destroyed by somebody she trusted. I think about how close I came to letting 5 days of fear write the ending before I had one fact in my hands. Here's what I've settled on, sitting on my back steps most evenings now with Junie beside me, watching the light go out of those hickories. Love without questions isn't love. It's just hoping, wearing love's coat. And the people who've actually earned your trust, the ones like my son who saw the danger and told you anyway, and then quietly sent money to a sister who wouldn't answer him, they almost never ask for anything. They don't perform it. They just show up early and stay late and expect no credit, which is exactly why so many of us look right past them for 30 years. My daughter is still my daughter. She made a serious mistake, born out of fear, a whole lot more than greed, and she is still paying the price of it every week with her own 2 hands, which is precisely where that price belongs. My son never had to prove one thing to me, and I intend to spend whatever years I've got left making sure he knows I finally see him. Some nights I still get the legal pad out from habit and sit at that table with nothing to write on it, and I think about Bernadette Osei sliding a folder across a desk and saying the words that started all of it. Please don't sign anything else until you've looked at this. I've come to believe that's true of nearly everything worth doing in this life. Look at it clearly first, then decide who deserves what you're about to hand them. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from tonight. I'll see you on the next one.